On a Saturday morning, July 30th, 2016, the silence in Colombian, a residential neighborhood in Mexico City, was shattered by a sudden, violent sound. A resident of a building on Miami Street went out to investigate. What she saw a few meters away was a scene no resident would expect: the body of a young woman, completely still, curled up in a fetal position, naked, and covered in blood. Authorities quickly arrived and, upon inspecting the body, found signs of severe trauma, extensive bruising, and visible impact marks. The young woman's face was bloody, and her expression suggested extreme violence or a fatal fall. Upon investigating the evidence and belongings, officers soon identified the victim as Stephanie MAGON Ramirez, a 24-year-old Colombian model who had arrived in Mexico only a month prior, seemingly full of professional dreams and plans. The investigation unfolded amid urgency and oddity. Initially, the position of the body and circumstances of the fall suggested a possible voluntary fall, leading investigators to consider suicide. But a series of inconsistencies emerged as the forensic team examined the scene. While no apparent signs of struggle were found in Stephanie's apartment, other details complicated the official narrative. Clothing found on the balcony, the violent impact suggesting torture, and the absence of close witnesses in an area filled with security cameras, all these details wove a web of contradictions and doubts. What at first seemed a clear, closed case now stood as the starting point of an investigation that would raise disturbing, perhaps never fully answered, questions. Stephanie MAGON's life and professional journey. In Cali, Colombia, Stephanie MAGON Ramirez lived a simple life with her husband, Anthony, a local electronic music DJ, and her young son. Coming from a humble neighborhood, Stephanie stood out for her easy smile and charisma. Driven by a dream that seemed unreachable for someone in her position, she aspired to an international modeling career. Her beauty was undeniable, but her limited height kept her from high-fashion runways. Instead, she found a path in commercials and editorials, where her image shone. In 2014, her career took its first solid steps when she was contacted by MIP agency, allowing her to secure her first professional work. Due to her determination and striking presence on camera, Stephanie began building a reputation, believing she was getting closer to the international stage. But in 2015, a tragic blow shook her life and her family's. Her brother, Julian, who also aspired to a career in entertainment and had moved to Brazil seeking better opportunities, was brutally murdered during a street fight. This tragedy deeply affected Stephanie and her family, leaving scars difficult to erase. From that moment on, she dedicated herself even more to her maternal grandfather, Manuel, and her mother, Magali, who were devastated by the loss. The grief did not dim her dreams, though, and she persisted, striving to turn her pain into strength. In 2016, new horizons seemed within reach. Stephanie received an unexpected offer. Mexico's new icon model management was interested in hiring fresh talent and saw in Stephanie the perfect image for their campaigns. The contact was made by the agency director, Pablo Anton, who offered her a tempting opportunity, a season in Mexico with the potential to open doors in other countries. The proposal to travel and expand her career seemed like the chance she had been waiting for. Despite Stephanie's excitement, her family did not share the same enthusiasm. The memory of what happened to Julian was still fresh, and the thought of her moving to a new country, especially Mexico, worried her parents. But Stephanie, determined to build a new path for herself and her family, ignored the warnings and began preparing for the trip. She was set on proving that her talent would take her beyond Cali's borders. After a farewell organized by her friends and agency colleagues, Stephanie left for Mexico in May 2016, carrying the weight of her family's hopes and fears, as well as a contract promising to cover her basic expenses while she dedicated herself to her work. However, amidst promises and expectations, Stephanie was about to discover that her path held a much darker fate than her dreams of success had foreseen. Arrival in Mexico and challenges. In May 2016, Stephanie MAGON arrived in Mexico, carrying the promise of an international career and the hope of changing her life. Mexico City, with its fast pace and opportunities, seemed ideal for the next chapter of her journey. She had signed a contract with New Icon Model Management, which would cover her initial expenses and facilitate access to new jobs. But her start in the new city was far from what she imagined. The reality quickly revealed itself as a maze of obstacles. Promised jobs did not arrive as expected, and Stephanie began to notice that opportunities were far less glamorous and scarcer than the guarantees she had received. In the first few months, she managed only occasional jobs, small photo shoots and commercials that paid much less than expected. These jobs, far from covering basic expenses, made her question if the agency was truly capable of delivering on its promises. As she tried to settle in the new city, Stephanie shared an apartment with another agency model, a young woman named Sophia, who seemed to face similar struggles. However, tensions grew between them, and Stephanie soon realized that sharing the space only added to her stress. She then decided to look for her own place, somewhere she could find peace amid the accumulating disappointments. In mid-July, Stephanie moved into a small apartment in Colombian, a middle to upper-class neighborhood where she could finally have the space she longed for. But the solitude of her new home and the mounting responsibilities revealed a vulnerable side. Far from her family, in a foreign country that began to feel strange, and facing multiplying challenges, she continued seeking new opportunities, believing that the difficult phase was simply a part of adapting. Stephanie stayed in contact with her family and husband, confiding her hopes and fears. She mentioned her desire to land bigger jobs, contracts that would justify the effort and sacrifices. However, the challenges persisted, and the professional environment revealed itself as a competitive world where contacts and promises often vanished. Still, Stephanie held on, believing that something would change and that eventually, her efforts would be rewarded. But as she persisted, larger, darker forces seemed to be weaving a net around her, unknowingly guiding her toward a fate that would soon transform her dreams into a chain of tragic and inexplicable events. The night of her death. On the night of July 28, 2016, Stephanie MAGON appeared to have renewed hope. During a call with her husband, she told him about a new audition scheduled for the next day. It seemed that, finally, a more significant job opportunity might arise, a relief amid the frustrations and empty promises she had faced since arriving in Mexico. The call with Anthony was brief, but it conveyed her anxiety and hope for a positive change. Hours later, in the early hours of July 29th, Stephanie organized a small gathering at her apartment. It was a low-key celebration, an attempt to relieve the stress and uncertainties. Friends and colleagues from the agency attended, and for a moment, Stephanie appeared at peace, surrounded by people who were part of her new life. Witnesses reported that the party was calm, with no signs of conflict, and that Stephanie said goodbye to her friends around 4 a.m. It was the last time she was seen alive. On the morning of July 30th, the silence in Colombian was interrupted by a thud that echoed down Miami Street, where Stephanie's apartment was located. A neighbor went out to check and found a disturbing scene. A young woman lay on the street, curled up in a fetal position, naked, her face and head covered in blood. As she approached, the neighbor recognized Stephanie. Authorities were called, and upon arrival, they immediately sensed that something darker might be at play. Although the body was positioned as if from a fall, the injuries suggested more than an accident or deliberate jump. The scene was laden with mystery. Extensive injuries, fractures, and the unusual positioning of the body pointed to the possibility, even more disturbing, that Stephanie may have been assaulted before her death. In Stephanie's penthouse apartment, investigators found no signs of struggle or violence. However, some of Stephanie's belongings, clothes, shoes, and her purse, were scattered strangely across the balcony, as if someone had left in haste or tried to leave confusing evidence. The apartment, which might have held traces of a final party, was silent and orderly, adding more questions than answers. Speculation quickly spread. Was it an accident? A desperate impulse? Or had Stephanie become involved in something more dangerous than she realized? The investigation sought answers, but for her family, who received the news with devastating shock, Stephanie's loss was unbearable. She was a young woman full of dreams, and the idea that she would take her own life seemed, to them, contradictory to who she was and what she had planned for her future. Stephanie's body, marked by wounds and wrapped in mystery, would become the center of investigations that raised more questions than answers, questions that, to this day, remain unanswered. Investigations and contradictions. The initial analyses of Stephanie MAGON's body, conducted by the National Institute of Forensic Sciences, painted an even more disturbing picture. The autopsy confirmed that the young woman had suffered severe cranial trauma along with multiple fractures, including a broken jaw and ribs. The injuries indicated brutal violence, something inconsistent with a typical fall. Yet, when the first toxicology report was completed, the results brought a surprising twist. No traces of alcohol or common drugs were found in Stephanie's system. These findings put authorities in a difficult position. At first, the signs of torture, the fetal position, and the fractures were seen as indications of femicide. The initial theory was that Stephanie had been assaulted and brutalized before her body was left on the street. This led to early expectations that her case would be treated as a homicide, attracting resources and public attention. However, in a sudden turn, the District Attorney's Office of Mexico City introduced a new line of investigation: suicide. The official explanation was that Stephanie had jumped from the balcony of her apartment of her own accord, and that her injuries were consistent with the impact of the fall. Authorities claimed there were no signs of struggle or defensive wounds, supporting the theory that Stephanie had leapt by choice. This abrupt shift from femicide to suicide immediately raised suspicion in the media and among the Colombian community closely following the case. Stephanie's family, who knew her enthusiasm for her career and her careful planning for her trip, vehemently rejected this new theory. To them, the idea that she would take her own life made no sense. After all, Stephanie had come to Mexico to pursue her dreams, and she was actively looking for work opportunities. Nothing in her recent behavior suggested desperation or self-destructive impulses. Despite this, the official version persisted in the suicide hypothesis. Authorities argued that the injuries found on Stephanie's body could be explained by the force of the fall, dismissing the need for a deeper investigation into potential signs of foul play. This stance, however, left numerous questions open and only deepened the doubts surrounding the case. The contradictions and rapid shift in conclusions turned Stephanie's case into a public enigma. As investigators maintained the suicide version, rumors and testimonies emerged, suggesting something far more complex. The haunting image of the young model, found on the pavement in a position that few believed to be natural for a fall, continued to disturb those searching for answers and challenge an explanation that, to many, seemed a convenient way to close the case. The family's lingering questions pointed to a larger mystery: what truly happened to Stephanie MAGON that fateful night? Hypotheses and witnesses. As the case progressed, new witnesses emerged, offering unsettling accounts of Stephanie MAGON's final hours. Among the most impactful revelations were reports that Stephanie had been seen at a party the night before her death, seemingly under the influence of unknown substances. Several people present described the model as disoriented and visibly altered, details that increased suspicion and cast new light on the tragedy surrounding her. These statements brought forward the possibility that Stephanie was not simply in search of professional opportunities, but may have become entangled in something much darker. The modeling agency that hired her, New Icon Model Management, soon found itself at the center of disturbing accusations and theories. Some speculated that the agency might be involved in human trafficking schemes, luring young foreign women with false career promises only to exploit them in exploitative networks. The agency's public image only fueled suspicions. The headquarters of New Icon Model Management, located in an upscale area of Mexico City, was unlike other reputable modeling agencies. With a discreet entrance and closed windows, the site featured a neon pink sign, an aesthetic that many described as shady and more suited to a clandestine environment than to a legitimate fashion company. 3 months before Stephanie's death, Mexican police had rescued 17 women, 10 Venezuelans and 7 Colombians, from a human trafficking ring in the same area. This coincidence did not go unnoticed by journalists and authorities, who began to consider the possibility that Stephanie might have been caught in a similar scheme. This theory gained further traction when Stephanie's colleagues from the agency shared messages indicating that she had been drugged on the night of her death. Audio recordings exchanged between models who frequented the same circles described Stephanie as being extremely doped in a bathroom where she reportedly began to undress and became incoherent. Although Stephanie was known to be an occasional marijuana user, witnesses claimed that her behavior that night went far beyond her usual state, suggesting that she may have ingested something much stronger, possibly without her knowledge. The police, however, seemed hesitant to pursue these new leads. Despite the testimonies, authorities stuck to the official suicide theory, resisting the possibility of investigating the modeling agency and its potential links to human trafficking. This reluctance only deepened the family's frustration, who questioned why authorities were so eager to close the case with an explanation that did not seem to match the facts. To Stephanie's family and those following the case, unanswered questions lingered. Why would Stephanie, who had always been cautious and clear-minded, act so out of character? Was she trying to escape from something or someone on that fateful night? And why did the agency that hired her appear so intent on protecting its reputation, even amid such serious suspicions? Stephanie MAGON's case grew increasingly complicated. New witnesses and emerging theories added layers of mystery, while the young model, whose hope for a bright future had brought her to Mexico, seemed to have been swallowed by a web of secrets, silences, and a reality far darker than she could have imagined. Closure and the family's doubts. After months of investigation, interviews, and twists, Mexican authorities finally announced the closure of Stephanie MAGON's case. The official conclusion was that the young Colombian model had taken her own life, jumping from the balcony of her apartment in Colombian. To investigators, the fractures and injuries found on her body were due to the fall, with no evidence of struggle or assault at the scene. But for Stephanie's family, this official version never held weight. Her mother, husband, and other relatives could not understand how someone so determined to build a promising career would suddenly decide to end her life. Close friends and colleagues were also skeptical about the suicide explanation, arguing that Stephanie had always been careful, responsible, and committed to her career and dreams. She had left Colombia in search of a better future and, despite difficulties, never showed signs of despair or depression that might explain such an act. Beyond the inconsistencies in the report and contradictions in witness statements, a larger issue loomed: the possibility that Stephanie had been a victim of an exploitation network. The agency, New Icon Model Management, that had brought her to Mexico became a source of suspicion, and the family believed Stephanie may have been drawn into a human trafficking scheme disguised as a modeling career. Although this suspicion was never officially investigated, reports from other models and the enigmatic circumstances surrounding her death kept alive the possibility that Stephanie had been exploited and perhaps silenced. The situation grew even more complex over the years, as similar cases of foreign women in the fashion industry found dead in Mexico gained media attention. This growing pattern, coupled with the evasive posture of the modeling agency, strengthened the family's fears that Stephanie may have been another victim of a predatory and systematic scheme. Even 8 years later, Stephanie MAGON's case continues to spark doubts and indignation. The questions her family raises remain unanswered, and the dark details of her death have yet to be explained. To them, the idea that Stephanie took her own life is a mystery filled with flaws and omissions. Her case is remembered not only as a personal tragedy but as a symbol of an even more disturbing truth: the unknown and unrevealed depths that surround the exploitation of foreign women abroad. Today, Stephanie's memory endures, surrounded by unanswered questions. Her name is mentioned alongside many other young women who, like her, went to Mexico seeking opportunities, only for their lives to be tragically cut short. And although the case has been officially closed, for her family, it remains an open wound, a cry for justice that has yet to be heard.